Well, folks, here we are. We made it to week number 10 on our Chronological Bible-in-a-Year reading challenge. That means we're 1/5 of the way through. Okay, this week we're finishing off the book of Numbers, reading chapters 23 through to 36. Shouldn't take you too long. Until then, sit back, relax, and enjoy today's tutorial. The book of Numbers is called Numbers, as I said last week, because it includes two significant national censuses, censi, plural, I don't know, two censuses of God's people. Right at the start of Numbers, we have one which happens about a year after they've come out of Egypt. Remember, they spent around about a year at Mount Sinai, and so Moses conducts a census of the people there and counts them. There's over 600,000 fighting men, so we're looking at a population, an adult population of 1.2 million plus kids. We could be around about 2 million mark people. Okay, that's all kind of guesswork, but that's kind of what we're looking at. And then in the book of Numbers, remember, as we saw last week, covers the span of that 39-year journey. So literally we have, let's just call it a 40-year span in the book of Numbers. And it's at the end of Numbers that Moses conducts another census. The reason for that is that in this 40 years, and remember the reason that they spent 40 years, or in Hebrew terminology, a generation, okay, this is where we get the idea of a generation being 40 years. It comes out of here in the book of Numbers. The reason they spent that time in the desert is because of the 10 spies who came back and sent a bad report. They're disobeying the covenant. They're not trusting God. God has enough with them. As per the Mosaic covenant, as he said he would, he'd curse them if they disobeyed. Okay, it's their fault. And he says, listen, this generation is going to die out and not go into the promised land that you could have gone into within a couple of weeks. So we've got this 40-year span in the book of Numbers. We've got a census on either end of the book. And what's remarkable, as you'll see this week, is the population, the numbers of the population doesn't actually change all that much. Okay, so even though people are dying every day, every week, every month for 40 years, people are burying their dead in the desert. If 1.2 million people over 40 years averages to about 85 people every day dying over that period. God, how morbid, right? Dying in that period of time on average. Even though that happens, the population still stays at around about the same. Obviously, at the end of the book of Numbers, as they get ready to go into the promised land, the population average age is obviously quite young because there's nobody over the age of 60. All right, something to think about. But anyway, so that's where we're at. We're at the end of the book of Numbers, at the end of that wondrous wilderness wanderings, and here we have a couple of key stories just as they are poising and positioning themselves to go into the promised land. There's 5 things I want you to pay attention to, or significant things that happened this week. So write these 5 things down. The first thing is we're going to read the story of a sorcerer called Balaam, okay? So this comes about because God's people are in the plains of Moab. This area is inhabited by a group of people called the Moabites. And what you're supposed to do, okay, when you come across a group of people like the Moabites, is to ask yourself, who are they? Where did they come from? And most of the answers for that are going to be in the book of Genesis, in the book of Origins. It shows you the origins of these people, okay? So Moab, when you read about the Moabites, Moab was one of Lot's sons. Abraham, who had a nephew called Lot, basically, the way I understand it, okay? After Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed and Lot lost his wife in a pillar of salt, he had 2 daughters with him. And those 2 daughters who want to have children to carry on the family line, they get Lot drunk one night, or 2 nights, they have sex with him, and they both have sons. And one of them is called Moab, and the other one is called Ammon. And so they become the Moabites and the Ammonites. And so these people, as they start to grow and as their legacy grows into the future, they become what we might call thorns in the side of God's people on into the future. In fact, thorns in the side is a figure of speech that we're introduced to this week in chapter 33 of Numbers. Okay, so take note of that. But anyway, so these are the Moabites. This is where they'd come from. And so the king of Moab is now watching Israel come to him, learning about all the battles they've been thinking, and thought, for goodness sake, there is no way I'm going to be able to defeat them without some help. So what he does is he employs the services of a witch. He employs the services of a sorcerer called Balaam. He also makes an alliance with a group of people called the Midianites. And so Balaam, who's a sorcerer for hire, is mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. And that's why I want to give him some attention, all right? Because in 3 different books, Peter, Jude, and Revelation, he is mentioned in the New Testament. So he is quite an important figure. The whole idea of Balaam, as you'll read, is that the king of Moab said, listen, curse the Jews for me. Curse the Hebrews. They're not called Jews yet. Curse the Hebrews for me. He goes up on a mountain. He intends to curse them, but God has his way. All right, and God says to him, there's no way you're going to curse my covenant people. And so he ends up pronouncing a blessing on them. Okay, 3 times, I think it is, he pronounced a blessing on them. And not only that, but you'll also see that he also prophesies, get this, he prophesies about Jesus. So he says to Israel, one day a ruler is going to come from you. And that great ruler will crush the skull of the Moabites. It is direct language from Genesis, okay? The one who is born of the woman, the seed of the woman, will crush the skull of the Satan. Will crush the skull of your enemies. He also says that this great ruler will be a star, will be called a star, and will hold a scepter in his hand. And the book of Revelation picks up that language 3 times. In Revelation, we see Jesus holding the iron scepter. And Jesus himself, at the closing chapter of Revelation, says, I am the bright morning star. So Balaam is prophesying about the coming of Jesus out of the Israel people. But don't think that that means he is now a good guy. Don't think that means he's now on Israel's side. Okay, because what he does seductively, what he does is he encourages the Midianite women to have sex or to sleep with or to seduce the Israelite men. So even though he can't curse them with his mouth, nevertheless he finds a chink in their armor. He uses Midianite women to have sex with them and then to offer them the forbidden fruit of idolatry. And so what we see, which again is a whole Adam and Eve picture, okay? So what we see here is we see these women have sex with the Israelite men, and those Israelite men start to engage in worship of false gods. God obviously finds out about this. A plague comes, and 24,000 of them die right there on the boundary of the promised land because they were committing idolatry, okay? And Balaam was behind that. That's why he's mentioned in the New Testament. He just because he's prophesying about Messiah and prophesying blessing doesn't mean he's a good guy. He's actually used as a warning as a bad guy in the New Testament because he was able to have this scheme against God's people. He found a chink in their armor, and it is amazing that all the way through the Israelites' history, this is a massive area of weakness. It's almost like this is the strategy that brings them down again and again. Engaging in physical intimacy with foreign women who then convince them with the forbidden fruit of idolatry, and that's how God's people are brought down again and again. So we see that happen anyway this week with the story of Balaam. He gets killed in the war right at the end of Numbers, where Moses has his last great military campaign, wipes out the Midianites effectively, which is incredible because they only used 12,000 fighting men. 2% of their fighting men went to battle, not one of them died. It was an amazing battle. Again, a sign of God's endorsement. While God is cursing them because of their disobedience, he is also still with them in a military sense because he is committed to getting them to the promised land. Okay, so that's the story of the sorcerer. The second thing I want you to pay attention to, I'll be a bit quicker on these ones. The second thing I want you to pay attention to is a census. Like I said, there's a census at the start of Numbers. That's why the book's called Numbers, and at the end of Numbers. The population remains about the same, about a 0.3% difference, okay, over 40 years, which is quite significant, quite amazing. But one of the significant losses that takes place is in the tribe of Simeon. And I found this really interesting. When I looked at the numbers and compared them, Simeon, the tribe of Simeon, has a decrease of over half of their population in that 40 years. So while other tribes increased in size, Simeon decreased. And I thought, why the heck is this? I went back to Genesis, where Israel is there with his 12 sons before he dies. You know, he's going blind and he's prophesying over his sons. And for Simeon and Levi, he prophesies over them together, and he says, you guys, your tribes are going to be scattered throughout Israel. And that is exactly what we see here at the end of the book of Numbers. Simeon and Levi are the smallest of the tribes,
as they start to go into the promised land. Levi, of course, has no inheritance, so he literally is scattered. Simeon, well, let's wait and see what happens to him. But all I'm saying right now is that his tribe suffers a huge loss over those 40 years, more than halving in size. So there we go, we have a census. The third thing we see in these chapters is a successor, where God speaks to Moses about appointing Joshua to continue his work, basically. And this is, in the era of the judges, a very common thing. God appoints a judge, he speaks to someone who is both a military leader and also a prophetic leader that hears the voice of God, who has a specific task for a specific time. Okay? God's people in this stage of history, listen, God's people at this stage of history are not a monarchy. In a monarchy, the father will appoint his natural son to lead, and Moses had sons. Okay, so if Moses was a king, he would have appointed a prince. He would have appointed one of his own biological sons to succeed him, but he doesn't, because God's people are not in a monarchical system yet. That's going to come in Samuel's era, okay, later on. They're not in a monarchy. They're operated by judges, and judges don't appoint their biological sons to lead. Judges are appointed when God decides to speak and give a leader a certain task at a certain time. So I want you to pay attention to that. Moses appoints Joshua as a successor, but it's the only time in the era of the judges that happens. When all the other judges come in the future, they are not a successor for somebody else. They are always appointed when God chooses them to come. Anyway, I'll talk about that when we get to the book of Judges. So Joshua is going to succeed Moses. The fourth thing is you want you to see in these chapters is that there's a couple of summaries. All right, so if you turn ahead to you read chapter 28 and 29, there's a summary of all the festivals. It's really good, actually, because it's in chronological order. So there you go. So all the festivals that they're meant to have, and the daily sacrifices, monthly sacrifices, annual sacrifices, they're all listed there in chapter 28 and 29 of Numbers in summary form. So have a look at that. And also in chapter 33, there's another summary chapter that talks about their journey in the last 40 years, and it summarizes everything. So it's kind of Moses' way of wrapping things up. All right, he's summarizing to this new generation of people the stuff that the first generation heard, but he is now summarizing for them what they need to hear as they're about to go into the promised land. And the last thing I want you to notice this week is that there is a split. Okay, there is a split of 2.5 tribes who decide to not go into the promised land. Can you believe it? All right, so here we go. Remember, Israel, strictly speaking, is 13 tribes. 13, because Joseph's two sons become 2 tribes. So there's 13 tribes. Levi are priests, so they don't become part of the military, and they don't get their own plot of land in the promised land. So from a legal and military perspective, there's 12 tribes. Strictly speaking, there's 13, but we talk about the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, 2.5 of those tribes, Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh, they come to Moses and they say, listen, we don't want to go over there because the land here is really good, actually. We reckon this is a great place to live. Can we please stay here? And so 2.5 tribes stay back. You'll read about that this week, which means that there are now 9.5 tribes that will go into the promised land and take possession of what God had promised Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. So that's the last thing I want you to notice. It's quite significant. There are, so that's why in the future we'll talk about the 2.5 tribes on the east side of the Jordan, and the 9.5 tribes that actually entered and took possession of the promised land. So that's another significant thing in the big picture that we are going to witness and see and read this week. So some significant things that happen. I want you to pay attention to 5. A sorcerer, a census, okay, a successor for Moses, a summary of a bunch of things that have happened, and lastly, a split where 2.5 tribes go their own way. I'm going to stop at 15 minutes. Bless you guys. Have a great week. Bye.
That's it for today's lesson. I really hope you enjoy your readings this week. Remember, allow yourself time to read as much as you can in one sitting. Don't get lost in the detail. Just keep going and watch the Bible's big story unfold before you. Remember also to hit me up on our social media channels or website, and I'll see you next time.